Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of DataBytes. Once again, I've got Mr. Jason Baumgartner here, and I've also got the masterful Chris Moriarty, who will be sharing some more data insights with us this morning. And yeah, he's growing things on the rest of his face to catch up with Mr. Baumgartner. I see I'm going to share my screen now.
We actually recorded all these on the same day, and this is just me growing in real time.
Yeah,
People will never know, though.
He's such a man, such a man. So here's the thing. We'll kick it off now. Here's our agenda for today. Let me see if I can get my agenda to work. Here's the agenda. The reason I have the agenda is it's pretty early in the morning. It's about 5 or 6 out in Washington, where Chris is at, and 1 hour later in Boise, where Jason is. So we have an agenda, because they're probably not even awake yet. I want them to know what to say. In fact, I'm not even sure they're wearing pants. So let's go ahead and jump right into the national. Let's go ahead and jump right into the national data. Jason, give us your thoughts on what's going on around the country.
Well, it's really encouraging. So for the second week in a row, we saw a slight uptick in total car count, or average car count for the week. From week 14 at the trough, week 15, week 16 actually increased about almost identical at an identical pace week over week.
All right, I'll show you a couple other numbers here. We've been sharing credit card transactions. One interesting thing, for the first time in a long time, you see the two arrows. We had a day of transaction that was equal to a pre-COVID day back in late January. Obviously, that wasn't a great day in late January. But nonetheless, we're getting back into some normal days again. So I think that's a really good sign as we crawl out of the trough, as Jason calls it. One thing we're adding this week is we took a sample of several thousand car washes, and just looking at what things being closed. And obviously, there's a lot of folks closed on Easter, but you'll see that not since March 22nd have we had this low of a closure number. So again. And by the way, I literally got data right before we shot this video. Yesterday or the next day, we'll actually be down another 40 or so sites. So we'll be getting down 550 or even under 550. So again, that's a trend that we like to see. Why don't you walk us through some of the state specifics, Jason?
Yeah, if you look at Nevada, getting close to about 20%, 30% away from where they were in 2019 for week 16. And if you look at Oregon is actually above in week 16 the number of cars, week 15 and 16, the number of cars that they did in 2019 on average. So those are really good signs. Again, Oregon, one of the earlier states to shut down. Washington is rebounding really nicely as well, after hitting that bottoming out week 13, week 14, seeing a nice little recovery, actually kind of mirroring the national recovery. So there are several states that are coming up to or eclipsing where they were in 2019.
And just to clarify here, the blue is 2020, correct?
That's correct.
I just noticed, I think I may have darkened out the legend there. Talk about some of the states that dipped a little bit.
Man, the M states are still kind of struggling. So Maine, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, even though Minnesota is up slightly the last 2 weeks in a row, really still fairly close to the floor in terms of the average number of cars washed per week. Maine is kind of in that same vein. Last couple of weeks have been pretty slow. Michigan, obviously, what's happening with that state. And in Maryland. So these are a few that you'd like to watch to see for that uptick, and maybe 2 weeks in a row of a little bit more aggressive uptick to see that they're rebounding. But so far, these states have been fairly laggard.
All right, let's talk about some states that are really getting close to where they were. As we look at the blue being 2020, talk to us about these states that look pretty good.
Yeah, and again, you've got Oregon in there who have eclipsed or gone back to 2019 levels. Kentucky's really interesting. The last 3 weeks, I was just almost identical. And then Georgia, started to dip. Looked like the spread was getting a little wider between 2019 and 2020, but it's starting to come back together. So a lot of positive signs across the country, and you'll see that later in the map.
All right. I got some additional data about closures. Some of the states that have come up that are like within one region, I find it interesting that just all in the same region of the Midwest. Ohio and Michigan have taken two different approaches from the position of car washing, and these are the amount of closures. You see that Ohio really went way high and has come back down, not to normal yet, but approaching normal as far as how many are open. And these are closures. And Michigan, again, seems to have the far majority staying closed. So we'll watch this trend as we move forward as a new metric. And there's just a couple other large states I wanted to give a view of, and that's Texas. Obviously you can see Easter here on a lot of these states, April 12th. Texas had a kind of a lower slope in general. And then California has peaked out and seems to be coming down on closures as well. So again, just another data point to share with folks.
Hey, Dan, on that point, going back to those two slides, is that just closures or are those zero wash days?
Those are zero wash days, actually. Thank you, Jason, for clarifying. I think that's important to note that these are actually where there weren't any cars going through the car washes for the best ability to know that. So closure is probably a bit of a strong word, but those are zero wash days. Great clarification. All right, everybody, we've got another look at our weather map of car wash, if you will, going on. And this represents a couple of different things. First of all, green means they were up over last week. So we've got a whole new team of green. Turquoise means they were up 2 weeks in a row. And then yellow is now a group of car washes that are up for their third straight week in a row. So we'll talk about how big of a change this has been, but certainly you can see that the amount of green has really increased across the country than down here in Texas, and again, a big state. So it's nice to see some of the big states like California coming in, turning green. You see Texas having a couple of weeks, and there's a couple states up here in Ohio and New York and New Jersey and some other states that are on their third week. Now, like in New Jersey, it's been somewhat gradual, but Ohio, we see it ticking up more. Another important note is, you see all the red states. Those are the only ones that are really down over last week. And many of them are polka dotted. And that just means that we think weather statistically affected this dramatically to the point where really we're not so sure it's because of COVID or because of weather. So we want to clarify that a little bit. So when you take that into account, we've got the majority of the states seeing a slight increase. We've got another new statistic we're going to show you. I'm going to flip it over to Chris. All right, Chris, you got another metric or another really cool tool here to look at the country. I want you to explain this take of the map.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to data, the whole thing's about storytelling. So as we've been able to collect more data over the weeks, really our job is to make sure that we're telling the complete story. And when we sort of had the are you up or are you down, well, as weeks have gone on, the answer to that's been more, it just requires a little bit more clarification. So on this map, you're going to see a lot more of a gradient where how much are states up or how much are states down. And so with this map, what you're going to find is the very, very lightest green, sort of your middle tone green, your deepest green. The deeper and darker the green goes, the higher the lift was for that week. And the same thing with kind of your orange to your red on their way down. What was interesting about this is Jason and I were looking at some of the initial data. He had pulled up a weather map of some of the severe weather that was from last week. And this was basically a mirror of that. And it's no secret that weather is a huge and a factor within this industry that needs a lot of consideration. But where I fear any one of these maps is the belief that it's going to generate. And so when the way people feel about a topic is way more important than the reality of a topic. So if you believe that things are hard and things are down, well, they're going to be hard and they're going to be down. But we wanted to be able to show that this whole thing is so fluid. And there's a huge political component to this that we are not going to touch with a stick.
Thank you.
But the reality is that things are improving. We pull a lot of tools in from actually finance, where if you're a technical trader, you're looking for certain patterns within stock movement or within a bond movement or whatever it might be. And what we're finding is a lot of those same tactics are useful here. So at what point can we expect the momentum to carry us even further? And with the predictions that we've made, it's basically what we're seeing. And that is a very, very good thing to say.
Very good, Chris. A great explanation. And it's also folks that have been looking at the states the last couple of weeks, they can now drill a little deeper to see what the trend is. You mentioned sentiment and how people feel. Talk us through that just at a high level.
So this is probably my primary concern. So for a reminder of those who might be new to this, what a sentiment filter does is it looks out across Twitter, Facebook, social media, and it looks for the words that people are using. So we scrape that, and of course it plots it um, as you're kind of seeing in front of you. And in the beginning of this whole situation, it was almost 80-20 green. You know, people understood we were in a situation nobody could control. Everyone was positive. Hey, this is what it is. But now, as certain states are trying to open back up, we're starting to see a little bit more infighting, and what this is creating is a lot more uncertainty. So you're seeing the general sentiment of the nation start to drift more negative. And again, primarily coming from that sense of uncertainty. What we've been talking to a lot of sites about is using either a sentiment filter or asking us or whomever, you got to match the tone of where you are. If people are hopeful where you are, then be hopeful. If people are frustrated, you can wrap being frustrated into your message. It's not right or wrong. It's about being authentic. If people are getting beaten up, it doesn't do you any good to run out with messaging that sunshine and lollipops. It's going to be tone deaf. But we can still be frustrated and still be helpful. So looking at this and understanding that it really comes down to how your community is going to respond. And because of the fact that we have sites that have such potential for high frequency, you can contribute in large part to what that feeling of the recovery in your area is. And we've had so many discussions and just ideas bouncing off the walls about how to do exactly that. So regardless of what you think, you know, we're all responsible for, in large part, creating the reality in which we run our businesses.
You know, I think back to probably 2 weeks ago, maybe even 3 weeks ago, Jason, we talked about the board. I see board as one of the key words, subdued board. Um, uh, there's a lot of noise around that, and we talked about the fact that people feel trapped inside their board, and they also want to be able to take control or do something. And car washing is something they can do. So I see that maybe becoming even kind of a more important message. You know, we had a little surprise, Chris, with the data. You had a request from somebody to look at, I think it was unemployment. Tell us what you found there. There really wasn't much correlation, was there?
Well, and this has always been one of the interesting things, and that's why we love data science, because you don't know how important something is until we look. So the request came in from a certain metropolitan area. They wanted to know what was happening in their community so they could better prepare their business. And what we found was actually in that area was really low. And we said, well, let's look state to state. Let's see if there's a correlation between the unemployment rate and the amount of washes that's going on. And what we found is that there was no predictive value in that number. So what's that tell us? And this is where, you know, they use the term heuristics when it comes to data, meaning that whoever's at the keyboard in large part is responsible for telling the true story. So when you look at a state like Oregon, and it has if you look on paper, it has a pretty low unemployment rate. But we got to remind ourselves, those are the people who are filing for unemployment, where that's a single digit number in Oregon, where almost, depending on the year, almost 30% of the people are on some type of food assistance alone, 52,000 on rent assistance. Like, there's numbers that don't show up in there. So what we want to warn people against is using single indicators from the news. We'll say thousands of people are registering for unemployment. Well, it's easy to grab onto that number because we think we understand it. But the reality is, in the data world, that number is essentially meaningless, because it could be covering up something that's a lot more meaningful. And you don't want to jump to any conclusions, because I couldn't find a single state where that correlation was strong enough that it should change your behavior. So you can't worry about that. You got to take that single number, put it to the side, focus on your members and focus on your community, and really don't think that that in any way, shape, or form is creating a cloud or any sort of buffer around you that's going to prevent your success.
Very, very good. In data we trust, or in God we trust, all others bring data, right? Hey, Jason, I want to close with you. You made a comment to me earlier this week about, you know, maybe we've improved enough that rather than week over week, we can start looking at some data from the floor. And I want you to kind of take us home as we end this with your thoughts on what's going on, what can help, and what we'll be doing next week.
Yeah, I think next week what we would like to show is states because there's enough states that have hit that bottom, that floor, that it's interesting to start looking at, instead of week over week, looking at the percentage difference from the bottom of the floor. And that's one of the metrics that we're using to figure out timing relative to when we step on the gas for our clients. So that'll be coming next week. We're excited about that. And then I had one quick point about, the sentiment filter. It's drifting negative. I see that actually as something that could be a real positive. I think you're starting, I guess it depends on how you look at it, but my dad used to tell me all the time that anger was a secondary emotion. And if you could throw frustration in there too. So frustration is a secondary emotion. So you're frustrated because, and you see all these words: bored, unhappy, unmotivated. That frustration is starting to manifest, and you're starting to get actual political pressure on governors. And so it's interesting how the negative sentiment filter is creating action in the political world as well. So it's just a fascinating thing to keep our eye on.
Very, very good. It's interesting, Jason. My dad, by the way, I met Jason's dad. He was a pastor. My dad was a pastor too. And I learned the same thing from him, and that is that anger is often a secondary emotion. It's usually hurt that drives everything. And as people are getting hurt personally, hurt financially, hurt
Right.
because they're tired of arguing with their kids, hurt because they're stuck in their house, that anger is going to come out. And I think we're going to see that's going to be very interesting, hopefully only interesting and not harmful, how these people work through these dynamics and figure out how to get their businesses open and get out there. So we lost Chris probably because of technical difficulties. So we'll wrap this up. Thank you, everybody. And we'll look forward to episode 5 here coming up in a week. And we'll see you later. Thanks, Jason. Take care.
Thank you.